Lisa was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. Our family home in Hawthorne, New Hampshire, was a cozy, weathered colonial-style house surrounded by towering maple trees. A wooden swing hung from the largest tree in the front yard, a relic of Lisa's childhood that she loved dearly. Even as an adult, she'd sometimes sit on it with her camera, capturing the golden hues of autumn leaves. Lisa was a freelance photographer, always chasing beauty in the ordinary. Early mornings often found her heading out with her battered Canon camera, searching for the perfect shot. One of her favorite spots was Eagle's Edge, a popular hiking trail about 20 miles from town. The trail was both breathtaking and perilous, winding along a rocky ridge with steep drops on either side. Lisa loved the challenge and the serenity it offered. She'd come home with stories of sunrise vistas and the occasional wildlife encounter. Our family was close-knit, though not without its quirks. My father, Richard, was a retired carpenter who now spent most of his time in the basement workshop crafting intricate wooden furniture. My mother, Eleanor, was the social butterfly of our neighborhood, organizing charity drives and dinner parties. Lisa was their golden child, charismatic, talented, and endlessly kind. I was the quieter one in the family, content to let Lisa take center stage. But she never let me fade into the background. She had a way of pulling me into her world, dragging me out for hikes or late-night photo sessions under the stars. She was my sister, my best friend, and in many ways my anchor. Everything changed on that fateful day in September. Lisa had planned a solo trip to Eagle's Edge, a last-minute decision sparked by a particularly vibrant sunrise. She left the house at dawn, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her camera in hand. "Don't wait up," she said with a grin. "I'll be back before dinner." Dinner came and went, but Lisa didn't return. At first, we weren't worried. She often lost track of time when she was out photographing. But as night fell and her phone went straight to voicemail, unease began to creep in. By midnight, we called the local authorities. The search lasted 3 agonizing days. Police combed the trail, aided by volunteers and search dogs. On the 3rd evening, they found her. Lisa's body lay at the bottom of a ravine, her camera shattered nearby. The official report ruled it an accident, a tragic slip on the trail. But something about it felt wrong. Lisa was an experienced hiker. She knew Eagle's Edge like the Lisa met Matt 2 years before her death, during a charity event organized by our mom at Hawthorne Community Center, a quaint brick building near the town square. Matt had volunteered to help set up tables and distribute flyers, and his friendly demeanor quickly drew Lisa's attention. He was tall and clean-cut, with a boyish charm and a knack for witty banter. At first glance, he seemed like a perfect match for Lisa. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Matt owned a small tech repair shop called Fix It right on Main Street, and Lisa often stopped by to chat or bring him coffee. He showered her with attention, always texting to ask how her day was, planning elaborate date nights, and surprising her with thoughtful gifts. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect couple. But cracks began to show about 6 months in. Lisa confided in me one evening as we sat on the back porch, sipping tea. "He's intense," she admitted, staring at the horizon. "Like it's sweet that he cares so much, but sometimes it feels like too much. He gets jealous if I hang out with friends or don't text back right away. And the way he shows up unannounced, it's starting to get under my skin." I frowned. "Have you talked to him about it?" She nodded. "I tried, but he brushes it off. Says he just loves me and wants to make sure I'm safe. It's hard to argue with that, you know." She forced a laugh, but her unease was palpable. Over the next few months, Lisa became increasingly reserved about her relationship. She stopped bringing Matt around the house as often and avoided discussing him. I noticed changes in Matt too. He began to show up at Lisa's usual haunts. The coffee shop she frequented, the park where she liked to take photos, even our house when she wasn't home. His texts became more frequent, almost frantic, asking where she was or who she was with. Lisa tried to break up with him several times, but Matt always managed to talk her out of it, promising to change. When she finally ended things for good, about 6 months before her death, he didn't take it well. The aftermath was unsettling. Matt sent a barrage of texts and voicemails, oscillating between pleading for another chance and accusing Lisa of betraying him. He even showed up at her workplace, Greenstone Photography Studio, with flowers and a handwritten note. Lisa had to ask her boss to intervene. "He'll get over it," she told me one afternoon, trying to sound confident. "He's just passionate, but he'll move on." I wanted to believe her. The day of Lisa's funeral was a blur of tears and condolences. Family and friends filled the small chapel at Hawthorne Memorial Church, a modest stone building with stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor. Matt didn't attend, and for a brief moment, I was relieved. The last thing we needed was his presence, turning an already heartbreaking day into something even more uncomfortable. But just a week later, Matt reappeared. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. Thunder rumbled in the distance as my mom answered a knock at the door. I stood in the kitchen, drying dishes, when I heard his voice. "I just wanted to pay my respects," he said, his tone soft and measured. I peeked around the corner and saw him standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain, holding a bouquet of lilies, Lisa's favorite flowers. His face was a picture of grief, his head tilted slightly as if begging for sympathy. To my dismay, my mom invited him in. She was always the kind of person who found it hard to say no, especially when someone seemed vulnerable. Matt sat stiffly on our worn beige couch, the lilies resting on the coffee table. He talked about Lisa as though she were still alive, describing her laugh, her quirks, and her love for pancakes drenched in syrup. "She used to say, 'No one made pancakes like you, Mrs. Carter,'" Matt said with a faint smile. My mom, visibly touched, nodded, her eyes welling with tears. My dad, however, remained silent, his jaw tight and his hands clasped in his lap. When Matt finally left, I confronted my mom. "Why did you let him in?" I asked, frustration bubbling in my chest. "He's grieving too," she replied, her voice shaky. Lisa meant a lot to him. I didn't say it out loud, but I didn't believe for a second that Matt was grieving. Something about him felt off, as though his sadness wasn't entirely genuine. It felt calculated, like he was performing for us. In the months that followed, Matt's appearances became disturbingly frequent. He showed up at family barbecues, holiday gatherings, and even my dad's birthday dinner. Always uninvited, always with some excuse. "I thought Lisa would have wanted me here," he'd say, or "Your mom said it was okay." And my mom, still lost in her grief, never had the heart to turn him away. Each visit left me on edge. He'd linger too long, his eyes scanning the room as if he were searching for something. His conversations often veered into uncomfortable territory, filled with intimate details about Lisa that made me wonder how much he truly knew or thought he knew about her. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. Our house was warm and festive, the scent of pine and cinnamon wafting through the air. Matt arrived uninvited, carrying a wrapped gift, a photo album he claimed Lisa had wanted to make for us. As my parents flipped through it, marveling at the thoughtful gesture, Matt cornered me in the kitchen. "She was different with me, you know," he said, leaning casually against the counter. His voice was low, his words deliberate. I stiffened. "What do you mean?" "She told me things she wouldn't tell anyone else," he continued, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite sadness. "Like what?" I demanded, my stomach churning. His lips curled into a thin, unsettling smile. like how she wasn't scared to die. The weight of his words hung in the air, cold and heavy. I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped, cornered by both his presence and his cryptic statement. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I waited until everyone else was asleep, then crept into Lisa's old bedroom. Her journals were tucked away in the bottom drawer of her desk, just as she'd left them. Lisa was a meticulous writer. Her journals were filled with everything from mundane grocery lists to deeply personal reflections. I skimmed through the pages, my hands trembling. Most of it was normal Lisa, doodles, song lyrics, little snippets of her daily life. But then I found an entry that made my blood run cold. The journal entry was dated 3 months before Lisa's death. Written in her neat, looping handwriting, it read, "I think Matt's been following me. He won't stop texting. Keeps saying he knows something I don't. I'm starting to feel like I can't shake him. I told him it's over, but he doesn't seem to care. Sometimes I think I see his car parked outside my apartment at night, but I can't be sure. Am I being paranoid? Or is he really out there, watching me?" My heart raced as I reread the words. The Lisa I knew was always so confident, so sure of herself. To see her express fear like this made my skin crawl. I felt a surge of anger at Matt for making her feel this way, and at myself for not noticing sooner. The next morning, I showed the journal to my mom. She sat at the kitchen table, still wearing her robe, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. I placed the journal in front of her and waited as she read the entry. Her face tightened, but when she looked up, her expression was dismissive. "Lisa could be dramatic sometimes," she said, her tone laced with forced calm. "I'm sure it's nothing." "Nothing?" I snapped, my voice rising. She literally wrote that she felt unsafe around him. She was probably just venting, my mom insisted. Matt wouldn't hurt her. He loved her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, who had been reading the newspaper nearby, lowered it and glanced at the journal. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened, a subtle sign that he wasn't as dismissive as my mom. That evening, as I left the house to grab groceries from Clearwater Market, I noticed a car parked at the end of the street. A black sedan. It looked eerily familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see if anyone was inside. I told myself it was a coincidence, but the nagging feeling in my gut refused to go away. A few days later, on my dad's birthday, Matt showed up again. This time he brought a gift, a coffee table book about hiking trails, something Lisa would have loved. As he handed it to my dad, he smiled and said, "I thought Lisa would have wanted me to give this to you. It was the last straw." After dinner, I pulled Matt aside into the backyard, where the air was crisp and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. The porch light cast long shadows across the lawn as I confronted him. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Matt's face remained calm, his ever-present smile unnerving. "I'm paying my respects," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Lisa broke up with you," I snapped. "She wanted nothing to do with you. Why can't you let her go?" His eyes darkened, and for the first time, his smile faltered. "She told you that?" he asked, his voice low and cold. "Yes," I said firmly, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "She told me a lot of things too," he whispered. "Things she didn't tell anyone else." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile returned, but it was colder this time, devoid of any warmth. "I was there, you know, on the trail." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She didn't fall," he said, his tone almost casual. "She looked me in the eyes and asked me to let her go." My stomach churned. "You're lying," I said, though doubt was creeping into my mind. He tilted his head, studying me like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Am I?" he asked. "Ask yourself this. If she slipped, why didn't she scream?" I couldn't breathe. The implications of his words were too much to process. That night, I called the police. I told them everything about Matt's stalking, the journal entry, and his chilling confession. The police arrived the next morning. 2 officers, Detective Harris and Officer Lane, sat with me in our living room while my parents hovered nearby. I explained everything. The stalking, Matt's sudden appearances at family events, and his disturbing words about Lisa's death. I handed over her journal as evidence. Detective Harris, a gruff man in his 50s with graying hair, nodded gravely as he flipped through the journal. "We'll look into it," he assured me, though his tone was non-committal. "Do you think he's dangerous?" my dad finally asked, his voice strained. It was the first time he'd spoken about Matt with anything other than quiet disdain. "It's hard to say," Harris replied, "but based on what your daughter has told us, we need to locate him immediately." The officers left, promising to update us as soon as they had any news. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety, jumping at every sound and compulsively checking the locks on the doors and windows. That evening, Detective Harris called. "We went to Matt's apartment," he said, "but it's empty." "Empty?" I echoed, my heart sinking. "Completely," Harris confirmed. "No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate anyone lived there recently. We're working on tracing his vehicle and contacting his family, but for now, it's like he's vanished." Vanished. The word echoed in my mind, filling me with a deep, gnawing dread. How could someone disappear so completely? The next week was a blur of restless nights and paranoia. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window, felt like a warning. My parents tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Even my mom, who had been so willing to excuse Matt's behavior, seemed unnerved by his sudden disappearance. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to revisit Lisa's journals. They were the closest thing I had to her voice, and I hoped they might offer some kind of clarity or at least comfort. I sat on the floor of her old room, the faint scent of her vanilla perfume lingering in the air. The journals were neatly stacked in the bottom drawer of her desk. I pulled out the last one she'd written in, the one with the damning entry about Matt, and flipped through its pages. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The same doodles, lists, and musings I'd read before. But as I neared the end, my blood ran cold. The last page, which I was certain had been blank the last time I read it, now bore a single sentence scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "He's not watching. He's inside." I dropped the journal, my breath hitching in my throat. The words burned into my mind as I scanned the room, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow and corner. My pulse raced as I realized how quiet the house was. Too quiet. Gripping my phone, I dialed 911. My hands shook as I explained the situation, my voice barely steady. "Someone's been in the house," I said, glancing nervously at the door. "I don't feel safe." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. I hung up and backed into a corner of the room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Minutes later, red and blue lights bathed the street outside. 2 officers knocked on the door, their voices calm but firm as they announced their presence. I rushed downstairs to let them in, relief flooding through me. They searched the house thoroughly, checking every room, closet, and crawl space. After what felt like an eternity, one of them approached me. "We didn't find anyone," he said, "but we're going to station a patrol car outside for the night, just in case." I nodded, though his words did little to ease my fear. Someone had been in Lisa's room. Someone who knew things they shouldn't. In the days that followed, life felt like walking on a knife's edge. I started to notice small things out of place. A chair slightly askew. A door left ajar that I was certain I'd closed. My parents brushed it off as my imagination, but I knew better. Matt was still out there, somewhere, and he wasn't done. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint creak from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to listen. Another creak closer this time. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police again, when my bedroom door slowly began to open. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open. The room was dark, the faint glow of my phone the only light. I held it tightly, my trembling fingers hovering over the emergency call button. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I saw a shadow, a figure standing in the doorway. My heart pounded as the figure took a step forward, their outline barely visible in the dim light. "Matt!" I forced the name out, though my voice shook. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they stepped further into the room, and as they did, a faint sliver of moonlight from the window illuminated their face. It was Matt, his expression calm, but unnervingly blank. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking as I scrambled back against the headboard. He tilted his head, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I just came to talk," he said softly, as if this were a perfectly normal interaction. I reached for the baseball bat I'd hidden under my bed weeks ago, my fingers wrapping tightly around the handle. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Matt ignored me, stepping closer. "You've been trying to paint me as the bad guy," he said, his voice low and measured. "But you don't understand. You never did." "Understand what?" I snapped, gripping the bat tightly. "Lisa," he said, his voice softening. "She didn't want to stay. She told me herself. She wanted to leave, to escape. I just helped her." The room spun as his words sank in. "You're lying," I said, though part of me wasn't so sure anymore. He crouched slightly, his face now level with mine. "Am I?" he whispered. "Do you really think she slipped? Think about it. Why didn't she scream?" I couldn't take it anymore. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back, letting out a grunt of pain. I bolted for the door, my heart racing as I dashed down the stairs. I made it to the living room and fumbled for the front door, but before I could unlock it, I felt a hand grab my arm. I screamed, twisting free and swinging the bat wildly. It hit something solid, Matt's forearm, but he didn't let go. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he growled, his calm demeanor cracking. In the chaos, I managed to kick him in the shin, and he loosened his grip just enough for me to break free. I ran toward the kitchen, my only thought being to put as much distance between us as possible. In the kitchen, I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands shaking as I turned to face the doorway. Moments later, Matt appeared, his face twisted in anger. "This doesn't have to end badly," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "Stay back," I shouted, holding the knife in front of me. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights lit up the room as a voice boomed from outside. "This is the police. Step away from her and come out with your hands up." Matt froze, his eyes darting toward the window. For a split second, he seemed unsure of what to do. Then he lunged at me. I screamed and swung the knife, barely grazing his arm. Before he could grab me, the front door burst open, and 2 officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Get on the ground," one of them shouted. Matt hesitated, but when one of the officers advanced, he dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. The aftermath was a blur. The police arrested Matt and took him away, though not before I heard him mutter, "She wanted this." You'll see. In the days that followed, the police uncovered evidence linking Matt to Lisa's death. They found emails he'd written to her in the weeks leading up to her accident, messages that grew increasingly erratic and threatening. They also discovered items in his car: a hiking rope, gloves, and Lisa's missing bracelet that suggested he'd been on the trail with her that day. When confronted with this evidence, Matt confessed. He admitted to confronting Lisa on the trail, arguing with her, and ultimately pushing her. He claimed she had asked him to let her go, but his story shifted so many times that even the police couldn't determine the full truth. Months later, after the trial and Matt's conviction, I returned to Lisa's room. It had taken me a long time to work up the courage, but I needed closure. As I sat on her bed, I opened her journal one last time. This time, the pages were just as I'd left them,